Jim Edwards with Eagle Forum. Happy to be here and thank you for coming. How many people have Googled something in the past 24 hours? Proves my point that the internet is something that is dominant and preeminent in our lives these days. We use the internet to look up an address or a phone number. We use the internet to order a pizza, to see pictures of a new baby of a friend who lives across the country. We use the internet for research or for seeing an episode of a TV show that we missed. We use it for countless things. The internet is always available, and so we kind of take for granted that it's always been there, but it actually is fairly recent. A century ago, the telephone service proliferated. There was an outburst in competition. Different companies were stringing their own lines across the cities and across the country. Well, the government imposed the Federal Communications Act during the New Deal. So for half a century after that, we saw order but little competition. President Reagan came along and broke up Ma Bell. AT&T became the long-distance service for us. In 1996, the Telecommunications Act let the Bells back into long distance, but they had to open up their networks, their lines, their routers to competitors. So a lot's happened since the 1980s. We've seen data transmission join voice signals. We've seen cellular transmission come online. We've seen transit network operators enter the market. We've seen broadband and fiber optics. We've seen new services and business models like Netflix and Amazon. We've seen the personal computer revolution. We've seen Apple rise. We've seen mobile apps come so prominent. We've seen the technological convergence of phones and computers and mass media and the internet and Wi-Fi, all in one little handy device, more powerful than the computers when many of us with a little gray were in college that expanded entire rooms. I'd like to remind us that substantial private investment has gone into making the internet what it is today. Billions upon billions of dollars have laid miles and miles of cable and built the infrastructure that provides Wi-Fi signals and internet connectivity pretty much anywhere we go. There's also been tons of investment in R&D and the commercialization of all this. We're seeing a political struggle now over who controls the internet, hence our panel today. This struggle includes, but it goes well beyond simply net neutrality. It has the implications for property rights, for privacy, for consumer protection, for intellectual property, for taxation, for antitrust, for competition, foreign relations, free speech, and innovation. Now, I'm just teeing this up. To sort all this out, we have an expert panel, a very distinguished panel I'm pleased to introduce to you. We have Ajit Pai, Commissioner of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Chairman Robert Goodlatte of Virginia chairs the House Judiciary Committee. Commissioner Maureen Ohlhausen from the Federal Trade Commission, and Chairman Scott Kieff from the International Trade Commission. I'm going to let the panelists come and give remarks. We're going to go in the order in which they're seated. I'm going to sit down for a few minutes. When the last speaker is gone, then I'm going to come back up. We'll have some Q&A that I'll direct, and then we'll have question and answer with you. Thank you. Ajit.
thank you, Jim, for that very kind introduction. It is an honor to be here at CPAC, and it's a special honor to be here with some very distinguished colleagues who have been laboring in these same fields, Chairman Goodlatte, Commissioner Ohlhausen, and Commissioner Kieff. I have the privilege, or the dishonor, depending on your point of view, of being one of the 5 commissioners of the FCC. As a Republican who's been there 2.5 years, and as a lawyer who had been there 4.5 years before that, I can tell you that I've never seen anything like this issue, and anything like what happened on Thursday. The FCC adopted on a 3-2 vote over my dissent wide-reaching net neutrality rules which will insert the federal government into virtually every aspect of how the internet works. And to tee up just how I see this issue, let me pose a couple of questions. What if I told you that in the aftermath of the November 2014 midterm elections, a group of White House aides was casting about desperately to look for a political issue that they could use to burnish the president's legacy? What if I told you that an agency didn't want to do what the president wanted with respect to net neutrality, but did it anyway? What if I told you that an agency came up with a 332-page plan to implement President Obama's plan to regulate the internet, but didn't want the American people to see it until after they had voted on it? What would you say if I told you that the agency decided to ignore the law and not put this plan out for public comment so that the American people could have their views heard? What if I told you that special interest groups here in Washington on the left were able to get all kinds of secret meetings with the White House and with the FCC to try to tweak the proposal to their liking, while people like you weren't able to have that same input? What if I told you that the FCC now would be able to micromanage every aspect of how the private sector structures the internet, from where infrastructure is placed to how end-user customer service is regulated? What if I were to tell you that the FCC will now start second-guessing service plans and other innovative projects that some of the wireless companies have, using what's called an Internet Conduct Standard? What if I told you that right after the FCC vote on this supposed Internet Conduct Standard, the FCC's own chairman, when asked how this would work, said, "Well, I don't know"? What if I told you that the new version of this FCC jurisdiction is going to be adopted using the analogy of a referee? And the analogy being the FCC will be the referee and will throw the flag depending on whether it likes what it sees. In short, what if I told you that the FCC, an unelected body of 5 commissioners, any 3 of whom might decide to solve a problem in a way that won't work, to address a problem that doesn't exist using legal authority the FCC doesn't have? If you like the answers to all those questions, you might be a supporter of net neutrality. But if you don't, if you cherish what I think has been the most successful free market, pro-competitive, pro-consumer enterprise ever accomplished in human history, you might be a fan of what I consider to be real open internet. The internet has been an unprecedented platform for innovation, for investment, for connection, for political speech, for all kinds of great things that we cherish. And I think it started back in the 1990s, believe it or not, when President Clinton, of all people, agreed with the Republican Congress that the internet should thrive free and unfettered from federal and state regulation. Republican and Democratic chairmen across the ages have agreed that we should avoid these utility-style regulations that the FCC adopted. But nonetheless, on Thursday, what we saw was an unfortunate and historic vote to subject these dynamic internet companies to the same regulations that were designed to handle the railroad monopolies of the 19th century and to handle Ma Bell in the 20th century. And I would ask you, do you think a small business in Minnesota with 4 customers that provides internet service is a monopoly? They wrote to the FCC and said, "We have anything but market power. We're struggling to keep the lights on, literally." Nonetheless, we treat them as if they are a monopolist who has power over a company like Netflix or Facebook or Google. What do you think? Do you think that a municipal broadband provider that President Obama himself visited about a month ago, that when they told the FCC that Title II would be a, quote, tremendous mistake, was making it up because they are a monopolist that has only in mind taking it out on the consumer? Of course not. What do you think about Joe Portman, who is the head of a small business called Alamo Broadband south of San Antonio, who is struggling with his own capital, not a dime of federal subsidies, to provide internet access to 700 people across 500 square miles of San Antonio, Texas? What do you think when he says that these rules could potentially put him out of business? Well, I'll tell you what the FCC says. They say what the New York Post reported President Ford said to New York City back in the 70s, drop dead. Essentially, concerns of small businesses when it comes to the internet service industry just don't matter, because this entire thing was a pursuit of an ideological agenda. The FCC had to invent a problem, had to invent digital dysfunction in order to regulate it. Now, where do we go from here? I frankly don't know, but what I can tell you is that February 26th was not the end of the process. I would expect to see a lot of court challenges in the weeks and months ahead. I think that Congress might well take a look at this issue, and I personally would welcome any effort to either reverse the FCC's decision or to deny its funding to implement it. And I think, depending on how future elections go, a future FCC could decide to revisit this issue. But what I can tell you is something that my many haters on Twitter are not going to like, and that is that I'm going to keep being a loud and obnoxious commissioner when it comes to speaking up for the rule of law, for free markets, and what I think is the greatest success story. And for what I believe is the greatest success story in American history, because I think that the internet is something that all of us have benefited from, and for it to continue to be that way, the FCC, the federal government writ large, is going to have to be more restrained and call a success what it is, a success. So I don't want to monopolize the stage. I know we have some even more impressive panelists who want to share their views, but I'd be open to any questions you might have.
Good morning. It's afternoon now, actually. It's a pleasure to be here with this very distinguished panel. I'll tell you, it's especially a pleasure to be here with Ajit, who is on the front lines fighting for your freedom in the most wonderful innovation that has been developed maybe in the history of the world, and that is the internet. The ability of people to use it for education, for business, for entertainment is a wonderful thing. And it is a great tool for exercising your rights under the United States Constitution, and we've got to protect those rights. So I'm committed to protecting an open internet marketplace where ideas and innovation and competition are allowed to flourish. On Thursday, the FCC approved what they call open internet rules that impose the most oppressive and backward regulatory regime on the internet. They use the last century's industrial policy to regulate the most modern innovation in history. And I believe these FCC regulations threaten the future viability of the internet and America's ability to compete in the global technology marketplace. In fact, earlier this week, I sent a letter with 20 of my Judiciary Committee Republican colleagues to the Federal Communications Commission, in which we outlined our severe disagreement with the FCC regulatory approach and announced a full committee hearing to further evaluate the issues around the FCC's approach. The FCC argues under the guise of net neutrality, and by the way, we are all for open access to the internet. I introduced legislation 15 years ago. We didn't call it net neutrality, we called it open access, but it was founded on the free access and competition of the internet, allowing innovation and ideas to go forward, and only when our antitrust laws were violated would government need to step in through our courts, not through a regulatory agency. So we support that concept, but under the guise of that concept, they're imposing additional regulation of the internet marketplace, claiming that it's needed to encourage competition and promote innovation. I am deeply skeptical of these claims. In my experience, regulation generally stifles rather than facilitates competition and innovation. In fact, it's my belief that the internet has flourished precisely because it has developed in a deregulated market. That's not to say that we should stand by and allow companies to engage in discriminatory or anti-competitive activities. Rather, I believe that the principles of net neutrality can best be achieved through the vigorous application of antitrust laws where needed. Strong enforcement of those laws can prevent dominant internet service providers from discriminating against competitors in their access, in their content, or in engaging in anti-competitive pricing practices. Furthermore, antitrust laws can be applied uniformly to all internet market participants, not just to internet service providers, to ensure that improper behavior is policed across all corners of the internet marketplace. The House Judiciary Committee conducted a hearing last Congress, June 20 of last year, to examine whether antitrust law or regulation is more effective at protecting consumers and innovation on the internet, and witnesses testified in strong support of applying antitrust law. All that said, I'm open to the idea of amending antitrust laws if necessary to account for characteristics of the internet, to make sure that small businesses, and there are millions of small businesses on the internet, have access to a legal process to protect their rights that is very expensive right now, and to make sure that the way our antitrust laws works can apply effectively with regard to the internet. But the FCC has instead opted to issue rules that will be challenged in the courts, I hope and pray, and be subject to litigation that I hope will reverse it, but it is not the correct approach to decide ahead of time what is right and what is wrong, what is a good innovation, what is a bad one. And this will have many detrimental effects, not just on the internet service providers, which are important to you and me in getting access to the internet, but also for everyone who does business on the internet and everyone who has need of access to the internet to communicate in any way, shape, or form, because it opens the door. In fact, some of the proponents have called it the foot in the door to deal with issues on the internet. It is the wrong door to stick their foot into. I believe that our efforts could be better spent on utilizing existing and time-tested antitrust legal principles to achieve the goals of net neutrality, and I will continue to use the House Judiciary Committee's jurisdiction over our nation's antitrust laws and enforcement agencies in order to protect an open internet and ensure that the internet continues to flourish in a competitive, deregulatory environment. That said, I agree completely with Ajit, not only in his perspective on what has happened, but also in how this is a very important fight. And it is just beginning. It is not at the end, it is just beginning. It will be long and it will be tough because of what the president has done here. To take a so-called independent regulatory agency and apply the pressure that has been applied to go about this process in the manner that it has gone about to achieve not a properly thought out approach, but a political approach to this problem. And we, as conservatives, protecting our rights for all Americans, need to stand up and speak out. I hope you will join us in doing that. Thank you very much.
Well, hello, and thank you to CPAC for having me back. When you think of net neutrality, the federal agency most people think of is the one that Commissioner Pai is a part of, the Federal Communications Commission. Now, I'm a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. So why am I up here? I've actually been involved in the net neutrality issue at the FTC on and off since 2006. So I offer some views based on that, as well as the kinds of capabilities that the FTC has to offer. First, net neutrality, to the extent that it's a problem at all, is a problem that the Federal Trade Commission has tools to address. Our expertise is antitrust, as well as consumer protection. And net neutrality advocates generally call for regulation based on the idea of market failure or a lack of competition in the provision of broadband, although I have yet to see any market analysis of justifying net neutrality regulation. And the FTC, now with over 100 years of antitrust enforcement experience, I believe is well equipped to investigate and prosecute any anti-competitive behavior by ISPs. And on the consumer protection side, Congress charged the FTC to prevent unfair and deceptive acts or practices. And net neutrality advocates are concerned, now they're concerned that consumers, that they'll sign on, they'll get their ISP access, and then subsequently be denied their bargain through like blocking or prioritization or throttling practices by their ISP. But such practices are straightforward deception cases, and the FTC has and will continue to get redress for consumers for companies that engage in such practices. Secondly, and perhaps more critically for U.S. consumers, the FCC's action on Thursday threatens the FTC's ability to protect consumers online. As I have mentioned, the FTC is an active consumer protection enforcer, and we've brought hundreds of cases based on online behavior for privacy violations, for data security issues, for things involving fraud, and the vast majority of these actors have had an online component to their violations. So while the FTC can bring cases against a wide range of online entities, under the FTC Act, we do not have authority over common carriers or entities engaging in common carrier behavior. And suddenly, this matters a lot. Because the FCC on Thursday declared its intent to reclassify some large category of internet service providers as Title II common carriers. Now, it's not clear right now how deeply into the internet Chairman Wheeler intends to extend the tentacles of Title II, but we do know from recent filings that's far enough to make even vocal net neutrality supporters like Free Press nervous. Reclassifying some parts of the internet as Title II would at the very least raise significant legal issues and questions about the FTC's continuing ability to protect consumers online from fraud or theft of their data or violations of their privacy. Every future defendant with a colorable claim of falling within the FCC's Title II definition will raise that argument. Thus, to paraphrase Commissioner Pai, the FCC's new rules are regulations that won't work to solve a problem that doesn't exist. And my concern is that will also limit the jurisdiction of an agency, my agency, that is actively dealing with online consumer harm. And that's just not going to make consumers better off. Now, I'm very encouraged to hear Chairman Goodlatte to raise concerns and for Congress to look at these issues. I think it's very important to set clear boundaries and make sure that we're maintaining genuine protections for consumers online. So I know that there have been a lot of Star Wars references flying around involving net neutrality, so I'll add mine to the mix. And I'll say, help me, Chairman Goodlatte, you're my only hope.
I join my colleagues in thanking CPAC for bringing us together and you for coming to join us for the conversation. What a great group of fellow panelists to share this discussion with. And they've teed up for you, I think, pretty clearly some tensions. And so I'm here, I guess, batting cleanup in this row to try to provide a little bit of context and to offer just two ideas. Okay, and so there's a disclaimer on the bottom of this slide. It's the ordinary disclaimer you see with a lot of government people. I'm not here to speak on behalf of my commission, my colleagues, my staff, but there's a last line to the disclaimer that's also, of course, important, which is that I'm not, and my commission does not, take positions on pending or proposed actions by other government agencies or by the Congress. And that is really the first idea that I want to offer you. Because I can't recommend what you do, but I can tell you that one of our core jobs at the ITC, one of our statutory obligations, is to analyze how mechanisms work and to do so independently. So if you want X, I can explain how X will work. If you want Y, I can explain how Y will work. And so my fellow commissioners have pointed out that there is a mechanism to the way this outcome was reached at the Federal Communications Commission. And to make another popular entertainment reference, the $6 million man. We have the technology, we can rebuild him. If you want to know whether we could construct in the United States government a commission structure that might be less likely to play out the way Commissioner Pai described, our commission at the ITC has some seemingly very boring, very down-in-the-weeds features that explain why we don't behave that way. I'd like to tell you that we don't behave that way because we're nice people. It just turns out they're nice people too. I'd like to tell you we're smart. Turns out they're quite smart too. It's the basic rules of the game that constrain our commission to act differently. And they're summarized here on the slide. They go basically like this. Instead of being an odd number of commissioners, we have an even number. We are designed for deadlock, 3-3. We have a chair who is required by statute to rotate person and party every 2 years. Rather than a chair who can be appointed by the president to serve for the term of the president and be removed by the president if she or he doesn't happen to agree with the president. Our chair switches every 2 years. Tick, tock, tick, tock. And when it's a 3-3 with a rotating chair, the rules of the game provide an incentive for people to be much more collaborative and much more independent. And we were structured that way in the shadow of the Civil War because, of course, the Civil War was an extremely violent phenomenon in the country that grew out of a deep political division. In that particular case, it was because we were doing a couple of things, one of which was financing the country largely on tariffs. This was before the income tax. And so tariffs were inherently political. So we created this commission in the shadow of that violence to depoliticize the decision-making. These basic structural ideas happen to have that effect, and if that's an effect you'd like, we have the technology. It could be used in other parts of the government to accomplish that outcome. The second idea is property rights. And property rights are not a one-size-fits-all, and property rights are not an unalloyed good, and property rights will not fix everything, but boy, they can be pretty helpful. Both on and off the internet, much more than tangible stuff, intangible stuff too, property rights turn out to do some really amazing things. They help people engage in the types of business arrangements Commissioner Pai alluded to. Private ordering, private people and private companies interacting with each other. That makes the economy thrive. So here's some data from the World Bank. The US financial system is huge. In fact, this is as a percentage of GDP, so of course Hong Kong is all the way off the chart because that's basically a financial system in a city. But if you're a country with a financial system, well, boy, we're doing pretty well. And why is that? Well, let's compare financial systems with respect to property rights. So think about how banking works. You're probably not going to give your money to a bank unless you can get it back. You're not going to deposit unless you have property rights in your deposit. Banks aren't going to give you money in a loan unless they think they can get it back. Minority shareholders are not going to be investing in a bank unless they think that their minority rights as shareholders will be protected by the majority. And of course, the bank is not going to want to set itself up in your country if it thinks the government can simply write over the ownership rules and say, now we own that, we the government. So in Mexico, it turns out in every single one of these relationships, depositors versus banks, banks versus debtors, minority shareholders versus majority. In every one of those relationships, the relationship is governed by something other than what you would generally think of as property rights. And as a result, no surprise, the entire country of Mexico, somewhere on the order of 18,000 home mortgages. Mexico's a big country. No home mortgages to speak of. Tiny. This is fewer home mortgages than Santa Clara County. I used to be out at Stanford University. That's the small county around Stanford. The entire country of Mexico. And that's because there are no property rights. Now, by property rights, it turns out the details matter a lot. And so if you think about rules where there is predictable enforcement, Commissioner Pai pointed out the throwing down of the referee's scarf. If you can predict that referee, that's one thing. But if the referee gets to make her own decisions, his own decisions, today based on one characteristic, tomorrow based on another, that's not predictable enforcement. And good flexibility, and by that, this was alluded to by each of the prior discussants. The flexibility to charge for more bandwidth or charge for less. The flexibility to roll over your data plan from 1 month to the next. The flexibility to charge for high speed or low speed. Flexibility. Flexibility so that businesses can be bundled and divided and traded with each other. Well, what incentives does that create if the rules of the game are structured that way? The incentives are straightforward. You and I, we as private citizens, have to interact with each other. What does that do? That makes it easy for us to interact. That generally has been shown to stimulate competition, economic growth, innovation, and jobs. But of course, you could structure the rules of the game differently. You could have another type of flexibility where government actors, maybe the referee throwing down the scarf, can change the rules of the game as she likes at a moment's notice. Where you and I and individual actors in the marketplace cannot bundle and divide and recombine. Well, what do we have to do then? We all have to turn towards the government instead of towards each other. Rather than interact with each other, we interact with the government. And when that happens, we set up a dynamic that is very congenial for those who are very adept at interacting with the government, the large established players, and very difficult for those who are not adept at interacting with the government, small and medium-sized innovative players. That is a system that will concentrate wealth and power. So the takeaway is that these very seemingly diverse fields, antitrust, net neutrality, intellectual property, finance, trade, etc., they all basically boil down to some common themes. If you make it highly political, you will favor those who are highly established. And instead, if you have lots of private flexibility backed up by some firm government enforcement, then you get increased competition, increased innovation, increased access for everybody around the globe. That doesn't sound like such a bad thing. And a lot of national economic growth back at home. That doesn't sound too bad either. I can't make a recommendation, but I can tell you if that's what you're looking for, if X, well, then Y. Thanks.
Thank you all. Chairman, Commissioner Pai, why wasn't the plan made public before the FCC voted on it? Was this another instance where we had to pass the policy before we could find out what's in it?
I think perhaps inspired by how successful healthcare was, the FCC took its lead from the White House and decided not to disclose the plan. And this is part of the reason why I've been so outspoken. The day after the FCC chairman sent this proposal to me and to my fellow commissioners, I tweeted out a picture holding it saying, "This is President Obama's 332-page plan to regulate the internet." I wish the public could see what's inside. And what I was struck by was not just the number of responses I got that were supportive, but the fact that even net neutrality supporters who wanted this plan to be adopted still wanted to see what was in it. They have no idea what the government is about to do. And I think if you ask the average person on the street, do you think the federal government should insert itself in unprecedented fashion into every aspect of how the internet works and only let you know after the vote how it's going to do that? They would say, regardless of political affiliation, absolutely not. Even though these are unelected bureaucrats, nonetheless, there should be some semblance of accountability to the American people. And I've been greatly heartened over the past several weeks that even people who violently disagree with me on the merits of this issue nonetheless agree that the American people have a right to see what is there. And I think it's critical for us to be as open and transparent as the internet itself, because otherwise, this entirely becomes an unaccountable agency doing political actions behind the scenes without having public input. And ultimately, I think this is going to redound to the agency's detriment. It's not having had public input before we took the vote could serve us poorly in court. A court could look at some of the decisions that were made and say, you know what, there wasn't enough public input on this. This record that you're basing your decision on wasn't developed enough. And so, ironically enough, the courts might have the last laugh.
Chairman Goodlatte, how do you think the recent FCC regulations will affect innovation and investment in the development of faster internet access and future applications?
Well, if you think about it, the internet is not owned by government. There are some places in the world where it is. And the access to it that you get and the services that you receive that are provided to you are provided by businesses that are also not owned by the government. So when they determine how to continue to grow this wonderful technology, they have to go to private capital to do that. And we have done that, and we've built out a wonderful, wonderful internet, not only for ourselves, but for the world. And in doing that, they have got to convince the people who make the investments that they're going to get a return on their investment. But if they don't know what a government agency is going to tell them they'll be able to do or not do as they expand that, increase the speeds, provide access to more and more remote areas and to inner cities, they're going to wonder whether or not they can do that. So that's number one. That's the first cost that you have. The second one is, I don't know of government regulation and taxation that doesn't increase the cost to the consumer of the services that are provided. If you look at the internet itself, we've had a moratorium on taxation of the internet, and I've been a part of that. In fact, right now I have a bill in the Congress. It passed the last House of Representatives, very strong bipartisan vote, to ban access charges to the internet. You take out your bill for your telephone, whether it's your landline or your wireless, you'll see all kinds of federal, state, and local taxes. Add them up, depending upon the jurisdiction you live in, 20 to 25%. That's a huge barrier to access. So we've kept that off of if you look at your access bill for your internet access, those aren't there. Our bill would make that ban permanent. The same thing, however, I would argue is true of regulation. No, you don't see the regulation costs on your bill. They're hidden in there. But if a company has to do business differently because of a regulatory decision, that cost is there and they have to pass that on to you, the consumer. So in both respects, I think it's very damaging. Finally, anyone who thinks that this is only going to apply to the businesses, some of whom are very large businesses that provide you with your access to the internet, and not going to hit, as Ajit's already pointed out, the small businesses that are also providing access to the internet, hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of them that are out there struggling to compete with those big businesses, you're wrong. And if you only think it's going to apply to those businesses, not businesses offering you all kinds of services and information on the internet, I think this is that foot in the door that's going to allow them to do that as well. So it's going to increase cost, and it's going to decrease innovation, and it's going to, I think, decrease the rapid expansion of the technology and the services offered on the internet.
Thank you. Commissioner Ohlhausen, in your opening remarks, you talked about the Title II reclassification could limit the FTC's ability to protect consumers, especially online. What are some of the examples of the kinds of actions that could be restrained?
So the FTC, I think it's very interesting that one of the things that the DC Circuit upheld in the previous open internet order was the transparency requirement, which requires ISPs to disclose how they manage traffic. They have to tell consumers, do they throttle, do they, do other kinds of traffic management. And if they don't adhere to those promises, then that's a fairly straightforward consumer protection deception kind of case. So the FTC has been able to bring cases against companies. So we have a settlement with TracFone, and they had promised that their wireless broadband service would be provided to their customers on an unlimited basis. But it wasn't provided on an unlimited basis, that they actually engaged in throttling even at times when there wasn't congestion on the network. So the FTC brought an enforcement action against them and settled that action and got redress for consumers, money back to consumers. We're in active litigation with AT&T right now on the same kinds of claims. So the issue then is, if the definition of Title II common carrier service is expanded by the FCC to now include a very wide universe of services, if the FTC tries to bring consumer protection enforcement, those defendants are going to say, oh, no, we're a common carrier. Everything we do is common carrier. Part of what we do is this, it's online. So now it's a common carrier service, and the FTC is divested of jurisdiction. And I'm very concerned about that, because the FTC is really set up to primarily be a law enforcement agency. We bring many, many cases to protect consumers. We have an active investigatory staff. We're very active in litigation in challenging these kinds of behaviors that result in real harms to consumers, right? Consumers are losing money. Promises aren't being kept to consumers. Not speculative harms that, well, we're concerned that down the road somebody might decide to, favor one kind of content over the other. These are harms that are occurring today. And the FTC right now has the tools to be able to address them. And I'm concerned that defendants down the road will be able to use the FCC's broad reclassification as a defense and oust the FTC from its, I think, very active role in protecting consumers online today.
Thank you. Chairman Goodlatte, what will be the prospects for raising the cost to consumers of internet access and services? Would you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I obviously tied together with your last question, but let me give you sort of a historic perspective. When I was in law school, way back in the 1970s, we had the chairman of the board of AT&T, the old AT&T, Ma Bell, as it was referred to, come and speak at our school. And he at that time headed up one of the world's great monopolies. And he argued that if you allowed businesses to sell landline telephones, you can just imagine this, landline telephones that could plug in to their outlet installed in your home, that could cause severe damage to the AT&T communication system. And I just came away from that just mind-boggled by that. It took a small competitor of AT&T trying to break into this marketplace, bringing an antitrust lawsuit that ultimately led to the Justice Department becoming involved in that, to the breakup of the Bell telephone companies and the opening up of competition, so that AT&T not only owned the lines, but they owned the company that manufactured the devices that were used on the line. Just think what a different world we live in today, where every week it seems one of the manufacturers of these devices is out telling you about the latest and greatest and newest. And how long did it take to get away from those black plug-in telephones that were the only thing that AT&T sold you? So this most definitely harks back to an era where the government is going to tell the providers what they're going to do, and then the providers are going to be forced to do something in a particular way that is going to reduce choices and increase costs to consumers, just like the way it worked in the bad old days. So that's what's at stake here. The breakup of the Bell telephone companies led to incredible innovation in telecommunications. You layer that on top of the development of the internet and its dramatic expansion, in much part driven by that same competition, and you find you are where we are today. This response to that is a horrific throwback.
That AT&T argument sounds a little bit half-fast. What effect, Commissioner Pai, will the heavy-handed regulations have on consumers and businesses? Kind of your perspective on the same thing we've been talking down the line.
I think Chairman Goodlatte has put it very well. From the perspective of a consumer, the effects are going to be pretty severe. Number one, you're going to pay more. Number two, you're going to get less when it comes to broadband internet access. And number three, you'll have fewer choices in terms of the competitive marketplace. In terms of prices, the chairman has put it very well. I'll simply say that right now, if you look at your phone bill, you'll see a line item that says something like universal service fee. That applies to your voice service. Now, until now, broadband had not been taxed because it was not considered to be like a telephone service. But as of February 26th, according to the FCC, it is. And if you were allowed to see this order, which you're not, you would see that the agency explicitly opens the door over the next couple of months to deciding not really whether, but how to tax broadband. And one independent estimate has said that that tax is going to be at least $11 billion each and every year. That's more money that you're going to have to pay out of your pocket for the exact same service. Additionally, there are all kinds of federal and state fees that go along with that. Some states have already begun discussions about how to spend the money that universal service tax on broadband is going to fund to this federal and state governments. Secondly, slower speeds. I mentioned in my remarks that a lot of the smaller providers, and even some of the bigger ones, are going to find it difficult to comply with these heavy-handed regulations. And it makes sense. If you have to spend $1 on lawyers and accountants to comply with FCC rules, you're not going to spend that dollar building out your network. You're not going to spend that dollar bidding on wireless spectrum to deliver mobile broadband. So we've heard from a number of different providers, from the big folks you've all heard of, to the smallest folks that you've never heard of unless you live in a small town, that they are not going to invest as much in some of these high-speed internet networks. And it just makes sense, as the chairman said. The more the complex the regulations, the more difficult it is to build a business case for deploying broadband. And third, it's going to be a reduction in competition. I think it's very telling, the chairman's anecdote about Ma Bell. These rules were designed, as I said, to regulate a monopoly, Ma Bell, which in turn were modeled on the railroad monopoly regulations of the 19th century. But if we treat this dynamic internet marketplace as if it were a monopoly, eventually a monopoly is what we're going to get. Complex regulations necessarily drive smaller competitors out of the business because they can't deal with the compliance costs. We've seen it everywhere, from regulations dealing with light bulbs to how toilets are manufactured. I mean, there's so much complex regulation that now you have a few oligopolistic or even monopolistic companies that are able to do it. Why? Because if you're a small entrepreneur, the last thing you're thinking about is building a business case based on regulations. You're trying to build a better mousetrap. So I think those three factors are going to have a pretty severe impact on consumers. And I'll be interested to see what the FCC's response is in a couple of years when consumers start complaining to us that they have less choice, they have higher prices, and less competition. What's going to be our answer? I don't think we'll have one because we were the ones who put them in that situation.
Thank you. Commissioner Ohlhausen, in 2006 and 2007, you headed the FTC's Internet Access Task Force. What were your findings and what's changed?
So one of the things that we did in 2006 and 2007, as this net neutrality issue began to really become more prevalent, is we had a task force and we held a 2-day public workshop. We received months of public comment. We wrote a 175-page report on the issue, which was passed in a bipartisan manner. So we had Republicans and Democrats supporting it. And what that report determined is that, is there a possibility that some anti-competitive behavior could occur in these types of markets? Absolutely. That's really a possibility in any market. Do we have the tools through antitrust and consumer protection to address those concerns if they arise? And we determined, yes, we do have those tools. So what's changed in that time period from 2007 to 2000 and now is actually, I think there are fewer bottlenecks in the market that could lead to anti-competitive problems. We've seen the growth of wireless broadband. It's been exponential since 2007. We have things like content delivery networks that cache content all over the country closer to people, so there are fewer bottlenecks in the network. There's more competition. The market has been moving towards more competition. And we've also seen the FTC bring consumer protection cases based on breaking promises about broadband speeds and throttling. Not a whole lot of them, because I don't think there have been a lot of problems, but it certainly demonstrates that we have the tools to address those problems as they arise. So I think when I look back at our 2007 report and its recommendations, our bipartisan recommendations, I think they've held up very well. So I would encourage people to look at it. So I think the changes are, we were saying the market was moving towards more competition, and we were proven right. Is any market perfect? No, absolutely not. All of them need oversight, the kind of oversight that antitrust and consumer protection can give.
Thank you. Commissioner Kieff, when you interact with other governments, as the ITC does, and companies around the world, do you get the impression that they try to play a goose and gander game that comes back at us when we deviate from the standards that we proclaim to hold to, such as a rules-based approach?
Well,
and how does this affect that?
Yes, look, it is the logic that we've each described goes by a number of labels from property rights to rules-based. And as the parts of the United States government go around the world and interact with the other governments in the world, in the context of antitrust, intellectual property, internet regulations, food and drug regulation, health and safety regulation, environmental regulation, we are often saying to the rest of the world, we hope you, the rest of the world, will work with us in rules-based decision-making. Decisions where the rules of the game are announced in advance, where the decision maker has her hands tied so that she cannot do an all things considered analysis, so she doesn't get to just make the on-the-spot decision to throw down the yellow flag whenever she feels like it. She has rules-based decision-making. Well, what was described as this week's decision does not resemble rules-based decision-making by almost any measure. And one of the things I think my fellow commissioners from other commissions, Commissioner Pai, Commissioner Ohlhausen, and I have seen as we've traveled is that that does get thrown back in our face regularly. The rest of the world is full of perfectly bright people who know how to turn on their television sets and know how to use the internet in order to observe what happens in America. And when what happens in America doesn't match what America says, we get a goose-gander problem. And it's hard. And I'll just go back to the Mexican banking system that I mentioned in my slides. Please be aware, make no mistake about it, the wealthy people in Mexico get mortgages. The people who suffer from non-rules-based decision-making are not the people who are most affluent and most politically connected. The people who suffer from non-rules-based decision-making are those who are most disenfranchised to begin with. And so the very people who all societies want to protect are the very people who suffer the most when non-rules-based decision-making plays out. If you're poor in Mexico, you cannot get a loan from wealthy family members because you're poor, and you can't get a loan from a bank because property rights and rules-based decision-making are not available, so no one in their right mind will lend to you thinking that a court will enforce the loan. That doesn't mean loans are not available. Loans are perfectly available if you're willing to trade a broken leg, a broken arm, a kidney, a gun to the head, or any other quite horrible outcome. Oh, you'll absolutely get a loan. But that means that the people who are most disenfranchised they struggle mightily in order to engage in lifting themselves up. Some of them are successful, and that's wonderful, but for those who are not, the payout, the repercussions, if you think it's bad to get foreclosed on, try having your leg broken. That's much worse. That's much more disenfranchising, and that's a shame.
Thank you. Why don't we throw it open to the audience for some questions? Yes, sir?
This is fantastic and so timely. We've heard a lot about Uber, and I have a question about Uber because it seems to me Uber is one of those companies, one of those services that the internet has facilitated that well have become, but it's bumping up against regulation at the local, sometimes state level. The foot in the door that the government is getting with this FCC is to say
I'd be happy to take a first stab at it unless my colleagues want to.
You go first and then I'll weigh in.
Sure. So I actually wrote an op-ed in the LA Times about a year ago about this because it struck me as bizarre that something so consumer-friendly as Uber and other types of applications, not just Uber, but Airbnb, 23andMe, all these innovative new upstarts who are creating some competition for the incumbents are being squashed by state and local regulation that is essentially an unholy alliance between these officials and the very incumbent industries they are meant to protect. And I think part of the reason why I've been so outspoken, even beyond the FCC's purview, about the potential evils of some of these regulations is that you can end up squashing some of the competitive, disruptive innovators who we want to enter the marketplace. And I think that's part of the reason why we need to make sure that at a federal, state, and local level, we guard against that instinct to protect incumbents at all costs. I think it's pro-consumer to be conservative about this and to have a very skeptical eye at regulation.
Jim just slipped me a note that I've got to go next door, and I hope you'll join us after the program is over. I've got to set up another, and your question is very timely. The subject is dusting off the 10th Amendment. So 2 points to make about that. First of all, there are a lot of arcane laws designed to protect incumbent providers, in this case of taxi and other transportation services, that try to use those laws, usually state and local laws. We just came to an accommodation in Virginia that has this effect. But that's a thing that should be fought out municipality to municipality and state to state. The federal government, for better or for worse, should not step in and say, we are going to start regulating the taxi cab industry because it goes through the internet now in terms of the most efficient way for people to find transportation. So I do worry that going ahead a few years, that there will be members, not Ajit, but members of the FCC in the future who say, oh, well, absolutely, this is an unfair way to get access to transportation. It's going through the internet. We regulate the internet, so we should regulate that. It is a risk. Thank you. And I apologize for having to go, but come next door.
And this is also a good chance for me to put in another plug for antitrust law. So the FTC did file a comment about Uber, where we were saying, regulators should allow innovative business models and beneficial for consumers. But we just won a case on Wednesday in the U.S. Supreme Court on this issue that when you have essentially private competitors who are making these rules to fence out innovative, disruptive competitors under the cloak of state involvement, that the state has to be involved in that, and that if it's not, the antitrust laws can reach it. So this was a case where a board of dentists in North Carolina didn't like that Crest white strips and mall kiosks that could do teeth whitening were cutting into their business. So they said, gee, tooth whitening is now the practice of dentistry in the state, and it is illegal for anyone other than a dentist to do this. And so the FTC brought a case. We won it in the Fourth Circuit, and we just won in the U.S. Supreme Court on this. So again, antitrust is a very, very useful tool to make sure that competition can continue to flourish in these markets.
Okay, last question. Yes, sir.
We now live in a world where other countries' internet is just ridiculously fast from ours. Countries like Romania have faster internet than us. In South Korea, you can get internet that is 1,000 times faster than what you can get in West Virginia. And the local internet companies have almost complete power in the state governments. Would you suggest breaking up companies like Time Warner Cable, Comcast, Frontier Internet with antitrust laws immediately?
First, I would dispute the premise of the question. I think if you look at more objective metrics, you would see that broadband investment in the United States is much greater than it is in countries that treat internet as a regulated utility. If you look at the comparison, for example, between the United States and Europe, broadband investment per household is $562 in the United States. It's only $244 in Europe. Look at mobile broadband. The United States is home to over half of the world's 4G LTE subscribers, even though we only have 4% of the population. In Europe, it only has 4% of the 4G LTE subscribers. 86% of Americans have access to 25 megabit per second service. That's only 54% in Europe. And I would submit to you that the reason why is not because companies are somehow more innovative here necessarily than they are in Europe, but because we have a bipartisan regulatory framework that heretofore has incentivized competition. Now, is competition where we want it to be? Of course not, but it's a function in part of the fact that we are a vast nation. I come from a town of 10,000 people that is hours away from a city you've ever heard of in Kansas. It's difficult for companies to build a business case for deploying to a place like that. Nonetheless, number one, there are small competitors like wireless ISPs and small cable companies who are somehow making a go of it. But number two, the FCC needs to get out of the business of micromanaging some of these networks to give the private sector more of an incentive to invest. Let me just give you one quick example. Aside from net neutrality, one of my biggest priorities has been what I've called the IP transition, making it easier for the private sector to retire some of the old copper lines that have served us very well for 100 years, but that clearly are not the future. We need optical fiber to connect some of these places in rural areas and urban areas to digital opportunity. But the problem is the FCC's rules essentially require these carriers to maintain the old networks. So by definition, $1 that you spend maintaining a copper network is a $1 that can't be spent deploying next generation fiber. And if we got rid of some of these legacy regulations, I guarantee you would see a lot more people connected. Additionally, one of the reasons why you see some more connectivity in foreign nations is that they don't have a promise of what we call universal service. It's embedded in the Communications Act that every American should have access to next generation services. That's been a historical commitment over the last 80 years. And I would submit to you that if you had a vast country like ours that didn't have this promise, you'd see a lot less connectivity than we have. So, look, I understand that competition isn't where we want it to be, but nonetheless, the solution to that isn't treating everything like a broken marketplace and regulating the heck out of it. It is giving the private sector the incentive to innovate, to take the risk, to deploy this capital, because these networks don't have to be built. Business cases don't have to be executed, and that's unfortunately the road that I think the FCC is going down.
Anyone else?
I don't think I could possibly add anything to that. So.
Thank you all, panelists. Thank you, audience.